Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Berlin, Thursday, 24 August 1939. Another day of perfect furor weather was fading. The Spree River was bathed in golden twilight. Freyja cycled home beneath scarlet swastika banners hanging slack in the sultry air. Around her, Berliners enjoyed their evening entertainment. Lovers waltzed on open-air dance floors. Street-side cafes buzzed with chatter and laughter. Well-dressed couples strolled towards the theatre district, ready for an operetta or revue. Her family's Linienstrasse apartment block had seen better days. Formerly a fashionable townhouse at the turn of the century, the building had been converted into flats. She inwardly groaned to see Gisela Vogelsang ensconced on the window seat of her ground floor apartment. With her hair dyed brassy red and eyebrows penciled in high arcs, the buxom woman was a nasty carbuncle. Her watery blue eyes observed all comings and goings. Heil Hitler, Frau Vogelsang, Freyja said, hurrying by. The woman raised her hefty arm in a perfect, rigid diagonal. Heil Hitler. You've missed the excitement. The swing kid got his comeuppance today. Gestapo officers left a few minutes ago. Freyja gasped. Dieter arrested? He's only 17. Gisela sneered. They just roughed him up, warned him to stop visiting secret jazz clubs to listen to dirty Negro music. I must get on, said Freyja. She wheeled her bike through the street door. In the dim vestibule, the youth was curled in a ball at the bottom of the stairs. Jagged shards of jazz records lay scattered around him. Dieter's eyes were puffy slits, his cheek bruised, his hair was shorn roughly, the scalp bleeding. Freyja was unnerved such harsh punishment was exacted for a taste in music. Why was jazz forbidden? Swing music was appealing, with its lively notes and infectious beat. And Dieter was innocuous with his scruffy hair and open-neck shirts. She liked his pep, amused by him using American slang. Okay, he'd chirp, a cigarette dangling from his lips. Today, nothing was okay. Today, Dieter and his music had been silenced. The minims, crotchets, and quavers splintered within the black shellac. Tomorrow, she would tell him not to let the Gestapo steal a tune from his head, rob the melody from his heart.
Elisabeth Storrs is the author of the best-selling series A Tale of Ancient Rome. And today I'm talking to Elisabeth about her latest book, Fables and Lies. Elisabeth Storrs, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Fables and Lies dwells within the genre of historical fiction and specifically around World War II. And that title, Fables and Lies, brings together two strangely connected words, alerting us to the idea that history is, has, and probably always will be contestable. So what role is there for historical fiction in exploring contested history?
Well, historical fiction I always see as serving two purposes. It reveals the past, obviously, a period of history, but it also should shine a light on the present. So the best historical fiction is one that's not just providing a backdrop to historical fiction and a plot line. It's actually should have an inner meaning or an inner theme.
Early on in Fables and Lies, a very interesting question arises for your protagonist, Freyja Bremer. She asks herself, wasn't history set in stone? So what does that question say about Freyja's life experience and her worldview?
Now, I'm glad you picked that up because I have to admit, I studied history at university, and there was always a sense from school that when you learned history at school, that was it. You know, that was the truth, that was the fact. And it wasn't until I studied at university that I discovered that historians all have different viewpoints and that they will contest each other as well, and that really you should always question any source that you're looking at when you're researching your book. So it became particularly pertinent in this novel because it's actually about the weaponization of history. That's one of the strands of it. And it became very clear when I started looking at the Nazi worldview, that history was malleable and they could propose quite preposterous things and yet convince a populace that that was correct. My book is set around a story where a young German girl indoctrinated into Nazi dogma. She is a museum assistant at the Pre and Early History Museum, which holds the amazing Priam's treasure, which was found by Heinrich Schliemann at Troy. So she is fascinated by history, but she has also been indoctrinated by the Nazi dogma. So the history that she has learned has really been twisted. So the first time Freyja questions whether or not history is set in stone occurs when Darien Lessing, who is a German man educated in Cambridge, returns after a long period in England back to Germany into her pre and early history museum seeking a job. And he has a conversation with the museum director and says that he has been working on a Bronze Age dig in England. And the director, Willem Unverzagt, says to him, "Oh, well, I hope you haven't been tainted by English interpretations of history." And she goes, what do you mean interpretations of history? Isn't history set in stone? And so that's the kind of launching point for her. She has this tussle with Darien Lessing because he comes in, he knows about the outside world. She has been locked in propaganda and really is ignorant of what's going on around her. She's been fed all the Nazi lies, all the Nazi fables. And he starts to open her eyes to the regime's corruption, their lies, and he starts educating her about the outside world and also what interpretations of history mean.
Freyja exists within a rather volatile family and social dynamic. While she shares a special bond with her father Conrad, her mother Elsa and her sister Folla entertain quite different perspectives on the objectives of the Third Reich. What is Freyja dealing with at home?
So in order to reflect society at that time, I set up a microcosm of a family. The father, Conrad, is a veteran of World War One, severely injured, and has all the reason in the world to want to accept the Nazi welfare that was offered at the time. But he is also a very staunch confessing church Christian. So he has a moral compass and he completely abhors what has happened in Germany. Then we have Elsa. She's the mother and she has really suffered from the aftermath of World War One. During World War One, while her husband was away, she had to be the breadwinner and she worked on a factory line. When the war ended, Germany felt completely humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, which imposed huge war reparations on them and also didn't allow them to have a military anymore. And really, more importantly, some of the trigger points for World War II, the Treaty of Versailles took away rich industrial heartlands from the Rhine, but more importantly, Poland, what became Poland. At the time of World War II, Poland had been obliterated as a sovereign state and was carved up between Russia and Germany. So Germans believed Poland was theirs. And so when suddenly the Treaty of Versailles said, well, Poland's a country again, then they really, really resented that the Eastern Territories had been taken away. And she comes from a city that was one of the Polish cities that got divided up in this treaty. She returns, he's handicapped, she has to still remain on the factory line. Finally, Hitler and the National Socialists, they start promising they're going to take back the Eastern Territories. They're going to give you a better life as long as you're a valuable German. So she sees it as a better life. And actually, in my research, I read memoirs, and one of them had a letter from a businessman saying that Hitler was an ideal man and he was going to make Germany great again. Sound familiar? She really believes the Nazis will help her, and to a certain extent, it does. It does give her a better life. Eventually, her husband can return to work. So she's what I call a Nazi believer that is not a fanatic, but is really benefiting from National Socialism. And then we have Foller, who is the fanatic. And she's a young woman. She's Freyja's sister, and she has been completely indoctrinated into the Nazi worldview. She has been fed it through her education. She has ended up having to go out and work because during the really dire times after World War One, she also has to become a breadwinner. She is really tied up in all of the very seductive propaganda that was saying that youth, German youth, they were the masters of tomorrow, basically. And then we have Freyja, who hasn't suffered that much post-World War One because she was at school. So she didn't have to go out and work. She's very close to her father. She's remained living with her father, who has this moral compass. So she is kind of ripe for the possibility of starting to question the regime because she doesn't quite understand the limitations placed on women, why they can only be mothers and housewives, that they're not given the opportunity if they want to do more than that. So she's kind of able to have a bit of a wedge happening with her, which then Darien Lessing opens up.
One of the central themes of Fables and Lies is the protection of the collections of historical artifacts that exist in the Pre- and Early History Museum in Berlin. And they're the things that enable scholars and academics to undertake scientific research. And Freyja is part of an effort to protect that collection. Part of that collection is known as Priam's treasure. It's a collection of artifacts that has a complex history in itself. Tell me a little about that collection and its history.
I was completely obsessed with Heinrich Schliemann, who was a German businessman, tycoon, that late in life decided he was going to go and find Troy. So he put all his money into locating Troy, which is in Turkey. When he was there, he discovered this amazing cache of gold and silver, but most spectacular of all was this gold artifacts that include drinking vessels and vases, etc. But he also found what he called the jewels of Helen. And they were these two headdresses of shimmering leaves of gold and necklaces and earrings. He was a great showman and promoter. And he decided to dress his young wife, who was considerably younger than him, and a Greek woman, Sophia, in these jewels. And they became like an overnight sensation around the world. They were featured in newspapers. And he also gained huge reputation for finding this treasure. And so he believed that he had found the layer in Troy that was from the Iliad. But it actually was 1,000 years before that. After smuggling the treasure out of Turkey to Germany, he decided to bequeath the treasure to the German people, provided that his name was forever placed on the wall in the museum. And it was considered a national treasure by the Germans. So in World War II, there was great fear that the national treasures, such as this type of antiquities, would be destroyed in air raids. And the German museum curators, who protected, well, all of the national treasures of all the museums in Berlin, the actions were incredibly courageous and dedicated. And by 1945, they were weathering two air raids every day, one from the RAF and one was from the Americans, and they still persisted in their safekeeping efforts. So at the climax of the novel, the Soviets invade Berlin and they seize all of the museum exhibits, including Priam's treasure. Stalin was also wanting to set up a super museum in a similar way to Hitler, and he'd sent out trophy brigade hunters to go through and recover as much as they could, basically plunder, just as the Nazis had been plundering. And they came into Berlin and they took Priam's treasure away, and it disappeared for 50 years. The Russians said that it just had got lost in the chaos of war. But then in the 1990s, they fessed up, and it turns out they had hidden it all that time in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, where it stays to this day. And they vehemently oppose returning that treasure because they see it as war reparations.
Freyja is conflicted both romantically and professionally. Promoted by Herr Dr. Wilhelm Unversagt, actually a real historical figure, to assist archaeologist Dr. Darien Lessing at the Berlin Pre- and Early History Museum. Yet she's intrigued by SS Untersturmführer Dr. Kaspar Voigt's knowledge and interest in prehistory too, who she meets at dinner in the Bremer family home. Yet these two figures, Lessing and Voigt, couldn't be further apart in their worldview.
As I said, Freyja has been indoctrinated in the Nazi dogma. She, along with a lot of school children and Germans in general, were fascinated by the Aryan myth. And Kaspar Voigt is a scholar for the SS Ahnenerbe, which was set up by Himmler as a research institute to research ancestral history. And one of the things he did was send an expedition to Tibet to find survivors or traces of the survivors of Proto-Aryan in Tibet who had survived the sinking of Atlantis. Kaspar Voigt is sent on this expedition, which was led by Ernst Schaefer, who was a reputable scientist at that time. And he is tasked in this expedition to look at racial studies, to look at whether there is any evidence of the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryans that had survived Atlantis amongst the Tibetan people. So the theory was that it was a great northern land that basically ended up being inundated because of a scientific theory called world ice theory that Hitler really believed in, which was totally bogus. And after the sinking of Atlantis, there were only small pockets of land that survived, the Himalayas, there was Bolivia, there was Canary Islands. And on those islands, these Proto-Aryans survived.
Darien Lessing, on the other hand, is a figure in complete contrast to Voigt. He's also an archaeologist, but with a perhaps more scientifically grounded view of history. But Freyja's attraction to Lessing leads her into much more dangerous territory. Firstly, what's the attraction and where does it lead Freyja?
At the beginning, there's friction between them because she finds him arrogant, and also he's kind of pro the West in terms of he actually does know that Germany is the aggressors in Poland at the time. But Freyja is fascinated by Kaspar Voigt because he is a famous explorer. He comes back from this Tibetan expedition. He has been tasked there to basically deal with racial studies, which later morphed into much more sinister activities through the SS Ahnenerbe. But he's sexy, he's rich, he's famous, and so she's attracted to him until she gets trapped and finds out actually how malevolent his research is and how he is prepared to threaten her father, Conrad, who is part of the rebellious confessing church, he is prepared to out him to the Gestapo, and she will not. She loves her father dearly, and she will not see him suffer. So she ends up marrying this SS man. But in comparison, Darien Lessing, who she initially finds really arrogant, and he really starts explaining to her the other interpretations of history about where the Indo-Aryan, which we now call Indo-European cultures, came from. In the end, she falls in love with him after she's been married to Voigt, so it's a forbidden love, and both of them risk being punished if Kaspar finds out. But Darien also encourages her to keep a diary about all the things that she's learning from Kaspar. She's kind of an amateur undercover agent. He tells her, the way to rebel is to keep these diaries so that they can keep track of what the Ahnenerbe is doing. This book is actually about small acts of courage, quiet acts of courage and defiance. It's not about great battles or great resistance movements. It's about ordinary people and the small things that they can do to defy the regime.
Elisabeth, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
And thanks, Greg. I really enjoyed the conversation.
I've been talking to Elisabeth Storrs about her new book, Fables and Lies. It's published by the Book Guild, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to Good Reading print and online magazine at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.